Dear church, let's talk about reaching your city. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. Excited to touch base with a good friend of mine. It's always good to see Jonathan Stormont, who's here with us all the way from Little Rock, Arkansas, the great state of Arkansas. We got Arkansas flag in the background.
Arkansas flag. Yeah, I'm a huge Razorback fan, although this year it is not a good year for Razorbacks. Are you a Tennessee fan?
No, I grew up in Arkansas. I'm an Arkansas fan. Woo pig.
Let's go. Yeah.
Yes. So to let our listeners and viewers know, you and I met back in like the year 2000. I was a non-traditional student at Harding. I had gotten into ministry after like a year of being a Christian. Left coaching, got into ministry. The church in Batesville, Arkansas said, "Hey, we love you, but you don't know anything. So we're going to send you back to school." And I went to Harding and took some classes, and that's where I met you. You were a traditional student at that time. I thought you were like a child prodigy because you looked like 13, and you were at Harding as I think you were maybe a sophomore at that time, something like that. But I saw the talent that you had and everything, and so I would use you in like devotionals and things like that at North Heights when I was there, and it's been a really interesting ride because, we don't see each other a whole lot, but then we talk and we keep in touch here and there. And then you moved to Abilene. And so we're there for a time together. And then now you're at Pleasant Valley and Little Rock. Talk a little bit about how that's going. Talk about your family. I think you have 19 kids, so that's exciting.
Yeah, my wife and I have 5 kids, which is, as the way Jim Gaffigan says it, it's like you're drowning and then someone hands you a baby. But it's great. I love our life. We actually I'm recording this from the house I grew up in. We moved back.
Oh, really?
My dad got sick. My dad has Parkinson's, and about a year after he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, Pleasant Valley reached out to me, and I left Abilene to come back home. And so now I work with the Pleasant Valley Church of Christ in Little Rock, Arkansas, which sounds like a retirement home or an old Monkees song, but it's a great church. And
it is a great church.
So yeah, I'm back home, raising my kids where I grew up and getting to minister to a bunch of people I love.
Yeah. It is a good church. I've been there. I've got several acquaintances and friends that attend there, and one of our elders, his son, attends there. So we know it's a good place, and we know that you have come in, and one of the things that is heavy on your heart and something that you have tried to get your congregation to rally around is what I want to talk about in our podcast today, and that is this idea of how we can reach our city. I've often said, and it's not my own concept, I've heard it before, but that your church should really reflect the community that surrounds it, right? And
Sure.
So often we're so homogenized, and if your church doesn't reflect the community, are you reaching your community? Are you truly stepping outside the walls? And so talk a little bit about, reaching your community, kind of how this all started and what you're trying to accomplish with this.
Well, I would say I have been really blessed by the churches I've got to work with. And the first one was the Richland Hills Church of Christ. Fresh out of Harding. Actually, I wasn't even out of Harding when I first started interning there. And working at the Hills when they were kind of plateaued. And I got to see a church go through the process of coming up with an externally focused vision. And I was 24 when Rick actually laid out what we then called the 2020 vision, which was a 10-year vision. And it was stuff like building a Church of Christ University in Africa. And they did it. And, huge mission ambition, huge evangelism ambition. And I got to watch a church kind of come alive to the mission of God. And I got to see how that happened. And good fruit of it. So, I'm standing on other people's shoulders, but I got to see what happened when a church does that. And here's the thing about churches. Martin Luther defined sin as curving inward on itself. And by that definition, I think a lot of times churches are tempted to become sinful religious institutions, because here's the thing about church and working in a church. Lost people don't send us emails, Chris.
Yeah.
The people who are, telling us how things ought to be, talking about, what they want in church, and those are valid, but it is often unrepresented of the people who are far from God. And if you're not close to people who are far from God, you're probably not as close to God as you think. Yeah. So one of the things that Vision does, an externally focused vision, is it helps church kind of wake up to the calling and the mission of God for the area around you. And not just the church as a whole, but the people who make up the church. There are people in our lives who we love, who are far from God. And we often think that there's this disconnect between what we do on a Sunday or a Wednesday and the people who are, in our families, our kids and grandkids, our nieces and nephews, our coworkers, our neighbors. And so part of what you're trying to do in leadership is help people wake up to the mission of God in their own lives, and the church as a whole to wake up to it. So I love leading with vision. I think it's the most healthy way to lead, because often what church leaders do is they just complain and lament that, I've heard ministers say, we're supposed to go into all the world, and I can't even get people to move up a few pews. And that's a vision problem. Because often what we do in church is we start with like the what or the how and not the why. And I don't know an institution that has a better why than the Church of Jesus Christ. And for some reason, we're tempted to just neglect the why and go into, kind of the what and the how.
That's a great point. I often hear people say we just need to get back to being the first century church. But I feel like we kind of talk out of both sides of our mouths with that, because in one sense, we have a good goal. Let's get back to being the first century church. But oftentimes the goal there is to worship correctly, right? So we look at the Bible as kind of an instruction manual on how we do church. And there's so much more to it than that, right? Because when we talk about being the first century church, they moved. They were a movement. And I like to say there's a time to gather and there's a time to scatter. So if we're going to use that as a jumping off point and say we need to be what they were, which I think is a good goal, if we're going to strive to be what they were and do what they did, we'll understand what that entails. That doesn't just mean we gather at a building twice a week at an agreed upon time, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. I like that language of movement because we're part of a restoration movement. Mm-hmm. And in the words of Dr. Jerry Taylor, we haven't restored much and we haven't moved in quite a while. And I wrote a book on Acts, and I love Acts, and I love our movement. And there is a gap between, just reading Acts with an honest, humble heart. There's a gap between these believers who are, risking everything, dying, becoming martyrs, constantly sharing their faith. When they're persecuted, they don't pray for deliverance. They pray for boldness. There is a gap between what we read in the first Christians and what we experience in our life. And closing that gap is the work of vision. It is to help people see, this is worth our lives and our resources, our time, our energy to, become. And by the way, the first church wasn't trying to be like the first church. The Gospel of Luke comes before the book of Acts. The first church was trying to be like Jesus. And that's what the point of Luke and Acts together is that they actually are. What Jesus did is what they did is what we're trying to do. And Jesus was
Yeah.
a man on mission, and his mission, to seek and save the lost.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important to remember as well, that the first church wasn't trying to be the first church. Be like Jesus, I think, is the best goal, right? And we often make the goal to get to heaven. I think if you be like Jesus, the destination's never in question.
Right.
Talk a little bit about this. Y'all call it renewal, but
Mm-hmm.
renewal all. Talk a little bit about the vision of renewal all and how you're trying to reach the city of Little Rock with the gospel.
Well, so because I worked with Richland Hills Church of Christ, I saw kind of how the process was, and I do think any vision in a church involves three different things. One, it's the passion of the people of the church, like what they care about, and learning to listen to what that is. Two, the passion of the preacher. And then three, what the city needs. Because no church can do everything. Then where those three things overlap, I think is a really good place to start working towards vision. And vision is something that you sacrifice, some things for main things. So at PV, our 10-year vision is, one, to reach 1,000 people who are far from God, to have 1,000 people baptized into Christ. That's kind of our hairy, audacious goal, man on the moon, which I think is important for having any kind of vision that is worth stretching and sacrificing for. The history of Arkansas and the city of Little Rock is pretty rife with racial tension. People have probably heard of the Little Rock Nine in Central High School. And so part of what our vision is to help be a community of racial reconciliation in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that involves, part of our vision is to fund bus rides for African American Church of Christ leaders and Caucasian Church of Christ leaders, and help them kind of remember the Titans. Them, you know what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
like bus
Yes,
rides throughout the civil rights. So we want to help fund that, not just in our church, but starting in our church, but then also for churches in the restoration movement around Central Arkansas to help be a part of building bridges. So the low-hanging fruit of our vision is, we say it every Sunday, every time we gather, is follow Jesus, build bridges, make disciples. And that's a really good summary of everything we're trying to do. We're trying to be a part of a disciple-making movement. And what that entails is that people are, so it's kind of culture in our church of being a part of a group of people in the same gender who are sharing their faith with one another, kind of their spiritual autobiography in a radically transparent way. And then in a small group of same gender people, they're sharing, kind of ways to grow in the Lord. And then turning around and doing that after a year of that, turning around and doing that for other people. And we're seeing really good fruit from that in the second generation of those discipleship groups, we call them. For the city, I think the racial reconciliation piece is huge, because some of those church leaders are also, on boards and leading other institutions or businesses. And so that's a big piece. We're also trying to do something like Hope Works, which is a ministry in Memphis, a nonprofit in Memphis that helps underemployed and unemployed people find a calling. That there in Little Rock, there are a lot of unemployed and underemployed people, and there's a lot of human capital there. And one of the things out of the Protestant Reformation was this gift of a theology of work, that God made us with gifts and talents, and that you know, one of the ways you serve God is by using your talents to bless the world. So
Yeah.
that's a part of it. Working with local schools to help. So just helping our church become more externally focused and using our resources to bless our city. That would be, you know, the big in a nutshell what this 10-year vision is trying to do, and on some level a couple of years into it we're already seeing pretty good fruit from that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Have you seen, the efforts leading to fruit, and what are some of the tangible ways that you've been able to kind of judge that this vision is going in the right direction?
Yeah, so great question. I would say one of the things that has happened in the last 18 months, and I just want to brag on our volunteers at our church, is what I mean, you've heard that kind of cliche, people find what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And if you were to come to PV today, I think one of the things that would be different than say 3 years ago is that if you're a guest, we've been thinking of you. We've been, preparing for you. One of the questions that's big at PV, and I think is important if your church is going to become externally focused. And by the way, not to the exclusion of caring for, the brothers and sisters in Christ.
Right.
I think that's a false dichotomy. But if your church is going to kind of be externally focused and think about the people who are far from God, then one of the questions you got to ask is, who is church for? Is church for church people? I've heard it said, sometimes churches ought to put their mission statement on the board, keeping the Smith family happy since 1997 or whatever.
Yeah.
Because that internal pull is strong, and it is. I think the question, who is church for, is a really profound question that anyone in church leadership needs to wrestle with. Is church for just church people? Or is it possible that God created this mission? Jesus creates his church and gives us this aggressive metaphor to do it. I will found my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I think a lot of times, like there's a decrease in, people signing up for ministry. You're seeing that across the board in evangelical colleges as well as, restoration movement colleges. And part of that is, I think, people don't want to sign up to give their life to keeping the Joneses happy. That may sound dismissive of the Joneses. I don't mean it that way. I think the best thing we can do for people is help them engage in the mission of God. And some of our more kind of trivial concerns of, I want church my way, or I want, I think those kind of fade away. People will sacrifice small uncomforts to be a part of a big mission.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And you're touching on something that, as a minister, I think I speak for a lot of other ministers, it just, can drive you nuts, is that, keep focused here. This is not about you and your personal comfort. That's not ever what church was intended to be. And I think that we have been held back, we as the church universally have been held back for so long because we get too caught up and wrapped up in the traditionalism and keeping everybody happy, and one group of people and will squawk enough that we'll just cater to them, and then another group squawks, and so we try to cater to them, and it just drives me batty because that's not what this is about. This is about mission, and that's always what gets lost. You spend so much time petting the billy goats that you can't tend the sheep, and you can't go out and seek the lost. And it is something that there needs to be a paradigm shift, right? So often. So when we talk about things like this, stepping outside the walls, even within the walls, talking over and over again about our mission, it's something that really gets me excited. How about How about there at Pleasant Valley? Has it been a challenge to get people to buy in, or is it really gone well overall? I know not everybody is going to buy into anything all the time, but have you found it to be a challenge, or have you found it to be really refreshing for the people to have some sort of goal in mind?
Sure. I mean, there's going to be challenge anytime you try to help. I mean, this is what we signed up for, right? Like, there is
Yeah,
not a leader in the scriptures who doesn't get challenged, and I actually
right.
think that's not all bad. Like, you know, um, there. So there've been challenges, but I would say that for the most part, Pleasant Valley has kind of bought in to what we're all trying to do together. And part of that is, and I think this is helpful, especially if someone is in leadership in Churches of Christ or a similar church culture. One of the things that I did, because Churches of Christ are pretty democratic, not that that's the right way to do it, but that's just who we are. Like, we want everybody to get a say. Pretty American, but there's some strengths to it. And so one of the things that I did both in Abilene and at Little Rock was, when I first got to church, I just opened up my office and said, "Hey, I want to get to know you," and didn't tell people what I was doing on purpose, because I didn't want to over-representative of one group or people who were trying to get their way on stuff. But what I was doing was listening to, what does this church care about?
Right.
And so I did that for months and months, one day a week, which open office, come talk. And I wanted to know, like, when was this church at its best? What is this church willing to sacrifice for? And I would just kind of ask those questions and listen, and took lots of notes over those months. And, you remember those three things I said, like the needs of the city, the passion of the preacher, and what the church cares about. That's what I was listening for there. I was listening to what this church cares about. And because of that, it was much easier to get buy-in, because the things that I mentioned that we're doing, trying to reach 1,000 unchurched people or non-Christian people, racial reconciliation, a lot of it has to do with missions. A lot of our vision has to do with revitalizing the passion of mission that this church has historically had. And there's a lot more than you have time on your podcast for, but it was stuff that was passion of the church, and that helped have a lot more buy-in initially and willingness to sacrifice, because no church can do everything. And
Right.
anyway, I think that was
Yeah.
a helpful way to do it.
Yeah, I think so. What would you say to, there's a church leader or preacher listening to this podcast and saying, I really think all that sounds good, and I want to implement that where I am at. Where do you start? What would be a good starting point?
There's some really good books that, if you're a reader, you can read, like 12 Church Dreams or 12 God-Sized Dreams, I think, by Patrick Lencioni. I think that's the name of that book. That's a good one. Visioneering by Andy Stanley. But here's my best advice, and I can tell it to you in a personal anecdote. So you and I were both in Abilene. I was preaching at this church that had a couple thousand members, and because of Abilene's culture and all the academic, all these students were coming in and they'd be there for 4 years and then they'd leave. Well, one of the things that happened in Abilene church culture was a lot of churches started closing themselves off, because, man, these people are just going to leave soon. So much transition with the Air Force Base and students. And, and then also a secondary problem was that people would go up to, in a big church, they would go up to meet someone. If they were trying to be hospitable and greet somebody they didn't know, they'd go up to someone at Highland and they would say, "Hey, are you a guest?" And the person would say something like, "I've been a member here for 20 years. And so what that did to the person who was trying to be hospitable was never do that again. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that was the culture. And I was kind of complaining and griping about that because it was making it really hard for guests when they came to church to be welcomed because people didn't want to be embarrassed or, do that. And so at one point, do you know who Andy Stanley is in North Point?
I do.
Okay. Well, there's a guy from Churches of Christ who was on staff with Andy, and he went to Lipscomb. He went and worked as like his executive minister, or senior staff thing. He had spent a decade with Andy, and one day he was at Highland, and he's hanging out. I'm talking to him, and I tell him what I just told you, and I'm griping about it. I'm complaining, and he says, "Man, you know what Andy would say? Andy would say, stop complaining, be a leader, take responsibility." And he said, "You're blaming these people. These are good people. They want to welcome people that are far from God. They want to do that. The problem isn't them. The problem is your leadership." And I was like, man, this guy's kind of a jerk. But here's what he did. And I think this is the answer to your question. For me, he made me realize that a lot of church leaders, there's a sense of blaming feels good and accomplishes nothing. Yeah. There is an agency that God has given you and called you to in church leadership where you can see the problems and you can lead with vision. You start with your why, and then you give them the kind of tools to be able. So for us, what we did at Highland was that next Sunday, and a lot of Sundays after that, we stood up. I had somebody, interact with me in a like skit-like way during the announcements, and I just said, "This is the problem. This is what just happened last week," and he called me out, and he was right. And here's what I want you to do. If you see someone you don't know or don't recognize, walk up to them and say, "Have we met?" And that is a totally different conversation starter. And you see what I'm saying? Like you give them the why and you give them the how to do it. Or you could just sit there and for years complain about the church culture that you as a leader could have led them out of and did not. And complaining and blaming feels good and accomplishes nothing. And so that's what I would say. I would say, look at the problems that are facing your church and accept that God has given you for this season a gift of stewarding responsibility and lead with vision. Help people see what they can't see yet.
Yeah, we've had that issue in Abilene and here at Walnut Street. I say issue where same exact thing. Come up to somebody, "Hey, I'm so-and-so, nice to meet you, glad you're here." And they said, "I've been here 20 years. And there's, almost like being offended. And so we've made it a point at both places to say, it's okay. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, you got to know somebody different. And whether they've been here 20 years or 5 minutes, isn't that the goal, that you get to know somebody better? And so I think we put too much emphasis on that and too much goes into the feelings of that instead of just saying, look, okay, it's great to finally meet you. You've been here 20 years. I'm sorry. Great to finally meet you. Let's talk more. I think what I hear you saying is it all starts within the walls. You equip your people for the mission and the vision at hand so that they can go and carry it out. Am I right?
That's right. That's right. Like, and I think if God has placed you in a position of leadership, then leading with the why is, I think, the most effective way to lead. People don't like being told what to do, but people will sacrifice for a mission they believe in that is bigger than themselves. And I think a church leader, God has called you for such a time as this to figure out what your church would be willing to sacrifice for, and then cast a vision for what it looks like to do that together as a church.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to see your face.
Yeah, you as well, Chris. Love you and your ministry, man. I'm grateful for what you're
Yeah,
doing.
love you. Love you too. And I want to tell all of our listeners and viewers that if you have a specific question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question for Jonathan, we'll make sure that we forward it to him, and I'm sure he would be more than happy to answer that. You can learn more about the Renewal Vision at the PV website. Give that to us, Jonathan. What's the website for the church?
Sure, it's pvcc.org, Pleasant Valley Church of Christ.org.
Yeah, and you can go to that and you can see a video detailing a lot of the things that we talked about today. And we want to encourage all of our churches to just be mission focused and Christ centered, obviously, but taking that mission that God has equipped us with to go out and spread it. And Jonathan, hey, thanks again for joining us, buddy.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. And thank you all for tuning in today. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.